Chapter 18. The Treason of Bishware. I wanted to find out who had been splashed, but Joe Kyvelson was too busy directing the new phase of the fight to hand out casualty reports to the press. And besides, there were too many things happening all at once that I had to get. I went around to the other side where the incendiaries had met their end, moving slowly, as close to the face of the fire as I could get, and shooting the burning wax flowing out from it. A lot of equipment, including 2 of the 3 claw derricks and a dredger — they'd brought a second one up from the waterfront — were moving to that side. By the time I had gotten around, the blowers had been maneuvered into place and were ready to start. There was a lot of back-and-forth yelling to make sure that everybody was out from in front, and then the blowers started. It looked like a horizontal volcanic eruption, burning wax blowing away from the fire for close to 100 feet into the clear space beyond. The derricks and manipulators, and the cars and jeeps with grapnels, went in on both sides, snatching and dragging wax away. Because they had the wind from the blowers behind them, the men could work a lot closer, and the fire wasn't spreading as rapidly. They were saving a lot of wax. Each one of those big sausages that the lifters picked up and floated away weighed 1,000 pounds, and was worth, at the new price, 800 sols. Finally, they got everything away that they could, and then the blowers were shut down and the 2 dredge shovels moved in, scooping up the burning sludge and carrying it away, scattering it on the concrete. I would have judged that there had been 6 or 7 million sols worth of wax in the piles to start with, and that a little more than half of it had been saved before they pulled the last cylinder away. The work slacked off. Finally, there was nothing but the 2 dredges doing anything, and then they backed away and let down, and it was all over but standing around and watching the scattered fire burn itself out. I looked at my watch. It was 2 hours since the first alarm had come in. I took a last swing around, got the spaceport people gathering up wax and hauling it away, and the broken lake of fire that extended downtown from where the stacks had been. And then I floated my jeep over to the sandwich and coffee stand and let down, getting out. Maybe, I thought, I could make some kind of deal with somebody like Interworld News on this. It would make a nice, thrilling feature program item. Just a little slice of life from Fenris, the garden spot of the galaxy. I got myself a big zoomy loin sandwich with hot sauce and a cup of coffee, made sure that my portable radio was on, and circulated among the firefighters, getting comments. Everybody had been a hero, Natch, and they were all very unbashful about admitting it. There was a great deal of wisecracking about Al Davis buying himself a ringside seat for the fire he'd started. Then I saw Cesario Vieira and joined him. "Have all the fire you want for a while?" I asked him. "Brother, and how? We could have used a little of this over on Herman Rauch's land, though. Have you seen Tom around anywhere?" "No, have you?" "I saw him over there about an hour ago. I guess he stayed on this side. After they started blowing it, I was over on Al Davis's side." He whistled softly. "Was that a mess?" There was still a crowd at the fire, but they seemed all to be townspeople. The hunters had gathered where Joe Kyvelson had been directing operations. We finished our sandwiches and went over to join them. As soon as we got within earshot, I found that they were all in a very ugly mood. "Don't fool around," one man was saying as we came up. "Don't even bother looking for a rope. Just shoot them as soon as you see them." Well, I thought, a couple of million sols worth of talawax, in which they all owned shares, was something to get mean about. I said something like that. "It's not that," another man said. "It's Tom Kyvelson." "What about him?" I asked, alarmed. "Did you hear? He got splashed with burning wax," the hunter said. "His whole back was on fire. I don't know whether he's alive now or not." So, that was who I'd seen screaming in agony while the fireman tore his burning clothes away. I pushed through with Cesario behind me and found Joe Kyvelson and Mohandas Feinberg and Corkscrew Finnegan and Oscar Fujisawa and a dozen other captains and ship's officers in a huddle. "Joe," I said, "I just heard about Tom. Do you know anything yet?" Joe turned. "Oh, Walt. Why, as far as we know, he's alive. He was alive when they got him to the hospital." "That's at the spaceport?" I unhooked my handphone and got Dad. He'd heard about a man being splashed, but didn't know who it was. He said he'd call the hospital at once. A few minutes later, he was calling me back. "He's badly burned, all over the back. They're preparing to do a deep graft on him. They said his condition was serious, but he was alive 5 minutes ago." I thanked him and hung up, relaying the information to the others. They all looked worried. When the screen girl at a hospital tells you somebody's serious, instead of giving you the well as can be expected routine, you know it is serious. Anybody who makes it alive to a hospital these days has an excellent chance, but injury cases do die now and then after they've been brought in. They are the serious cases. "Well, I don't suppose there's anything we can do," Joe said heavily. "We can clean up on the gang that started this fire," Oscar Fujisawa said. "Do it now. Then, if Tom doesn't make it, he's paid for in advance." Oscar, I recalled, was the one who had been the most impressed with Bish Ware's argument that lynching Steve Ravik would cost the hunters the 4 million sols they might otherwise be able to recover, after a few years' interstellar litigation, from his bank account on Terra. That reminded me that I hadn't even thought of Bish since I'd left the Times. I called back. Dad hadn't heard a word from him. "What's the situation at Hunter's Hall?" I asked. "Everything's quiet there. The police left when Hallstock commandeered that firefighting equipment. They helped the shipyard men get it out, and then they all went to the municipal building. As far as I know, both Ravik and Belcher are still in Hunter's Hall. I'm in contact with the vehicles on guard at the approaches. I'll call them now." I relayed that. The others nodded. "Nip Spazzoni and a few others are bringing men and guns up from the docks and putting a cordon around the place on the main city level," Oscar said. "Your father will probably be hearing that they're moving into position now." He had. He also said that he had called all the vehicles on the first and second levels down. They all reported no activity in Hunter's Hall, except one jeep on second level down, which did not report at all. Everybody was puzzled about that. "That's the jeep that reported Bish Ware going in on the bottom," Mohandas Feinberg said. "I wonder if somebody inside mightn't have gotten both the man on the jeep and Bish." "He could have left the jeep," Joe said. "Maybe he went inside after Bish." "Funny he didn't call in and say so," somebody said. "No, it isn't," I contradicted. "Manufacturer's claims to the contrary. There is no such thing as a tap-proof radio. Maybe he wasn't supposed to leave his post, but if he did, he used his head, not advertising it." "That makes sense," Oscar agreed. "Well, whatever happened, we're not doing anything standing around up here. Let's get it started." He walked away, raising his voice and calling, "Pequod! Pequod! All hands on deck!" The others broke away from the group, shouting the names of their ships to rally their crews. I hurried over to the jeep and checked my equipment. There wasn't too much film left in the big audiovisual, so I replaced it with a fresh sound and visual reel, good for another couple of hours, and then lifted to the ceiling. Worrying about Tom wouldn't help Tom, and worrying about Bish wouldn't help Bish, and I had a job to do. What I was getting now, and I was glad I was starting a fresh reel for it, was the beginning of the first Fenris Civil War. A long time from now, when Fenris was an important planet in the Federation, maybe they'd make today a holiday, like Bastille Day, or the 4th of July, or Federation Day. Maybe historians, a couple of centuries from now, would call me an important primary source, and if Cesario's religion was right, Maybe I'd be one of them, saying, "Well, after all, is Boyd such a reliable source? He was only 17 years old at the time." Finally, after a lot of yelling and confusion, the rebel army got moving. We all went up to main city level and went down Broadway, spreading out side streets when we began running into the cordon that had been thrown around Hunter's Hall. They were mostly men from the waterfront who hadn't gotten to the wax fire, and they must have stripped the guns off half the ships in the harbor and mounted them on lorries or cargo skids. Nobody, not even Joe Kybelson, wanted to begin with any massed frontal attack on Hunter's Hall. "We'll have to bombard the place," he was saying. "We try to rush it, and we'll lose half our gang before we get in. One man with good cover and a machine gun's good for a couple of hundred in the open." "Bish may be inside," I mentioned. "Yes," Oscar said, "and even aside from that building was built with our money. Let's don't burn the house down to get rid of the cockroaches." "Well, how are you going to do it then?" Joe wanted to know. Rule out frontal attack, and Joe's at the end of his tactics. "You stay up here. Keep them amused with a little small arms fire at the windows and so on. I'll take about a dozen men and go down to second level. If we can't do anything else, we can bring a couple of skins of tallow wax down and set fire to it and smoke them out." That sounded like a pretty expensive sort of smudge, but seeing how much wax Ravik had burned uptown, it was only fair to let him in on some of the smoke. I mentioned that if we got into the building and up to main city level, we'd need some way of signaling to avoid being shot by our own gang, and got the wavelength combination of the Pequod scout boat, which Joe and Oscar were using for a command car. Oscar picked 10 or 12 men, and they got into a lorry and went uptown and down a vehicle shaft to second level. I followed in my Jeep, even after Oscar and his crowd let down and got out, and hovered behind them as they advanced on foot to Hunter's Hall. The second level down was the vehicle storage, where the derricks and other equipment had been kept. It was empty now, except for a workbench, a hand forge, and some other things like that, a few drums of lubricant, and several piles of sheet metal. Oscar and his men got inside, and I followed, going up to the ceiling. I was the one who saw the man lying back of a pile of sheet metal and called their attention. He wore boat clothes and had black whiskers, and he had a knife and a pistol on his belt. At first, I thought he was dead. A couple of Oscar's followers, dragging him out, said, "He's been sleep-gassed." Somebody else recognized him. He was the lone man who had been on guard in the Jeep. The Jeep was nowhere in sight. I began to be really worried. My lighter gadget could have been what had gassed him. It probably was. There weren't many sleep gas weapons on Fenris. I had to get fills made up specially for mine, so it looked to me as though somebody had gotten mine off Bish, and then used it to knock out our guard. Taken it off his body, I guessed. That crowd wasn't any more interested in taking prisoners alive than we were. We laid the man on a workbench and put a rolled-up sack under his head for a pillow. Then we started up the enclosed stairway. I didn't think we were going to run into any trouble, though I kept my hand close to my gun. If they'd knocked out the guard, they had a way out, and none of them wanted to stay in that building any longer than they had to. The first level down was mostly storerooms, with nobody in any of them. As we went up the stairway to the main city level, we could hear firing outside. Nobody inside was shooting back. I unhooked my handphone. "We're in," I said, when Joe Kybelson answered. "Stop the shooting. We're coming up to the vehicle port." "Might as well. Nobody's paying any attention to it," he said. The firing slacked off as the word was passed around the perimeter, and finally it stopped entirely. We went up into the open arched vehicle port. It was barricaded all around, and there were a half-dozen machine guns set up, but not a living thing. "We're going up," I said. "They've all lammed out. The place is empty." "You don't know that," Oscar chided. It might be bulging with Ravik's thugs, waiting for us to come walking up and be mowed down. Possible. Highly improbable, though, I thought. The escalators weren't running, and we weren't going to alert any hypothetical ambush by starting them. We tiptoed up, and I even drew my pistol to show that I wasn't being foolhardy. The big social room was empty. A couple of us went over and looked behind the bar, which was the only hiding place in it. Then we went back to the rear and tiptoed to the 3rd floor. The meeting room was empty. So were the offices behind it. I looked in all of them, expecting to find Bish Ware's body. Maybe a couple of other bodies, too. I'd seen him shoot the tread snail, and I didn't think he'd die unpaid for. In Steve Ravik's office, the safe was open, and a lot of papers had been thrown out. I pointed that out to Oscar, and he nodded. After seeing that, he seemed to relax, as though he wasn't expecting to find anybody anymore. We went to the 3rd floor. Ravik's living quarters were there, and they were magnificently luxurious. The hunters, whose money had paid for all that magnificence and luxury, cursed. There were no bodies there either, or on the landing stage above. I unhooked the radio again. "You can come in now," I said. "The place is empty. Nobody here but us vigilantes." "Huh?" Joe couldn't believe that. "How'd they get out?" "They got out on the 2nd level down." I told him about the sleep-gassed guard. "Did you bring him to? What did he say?" "Nothing. We didn't. We can't. You get sleep-gassed, and you sleep till you wake up. That ought to be 2 to 4 hours for this fellow." "Well, hold everything. We're coming in." We were all in the social room. A couple of the men had poured drinks or drawn themselves beers at the bar and rung up no sale on the cash register. Somebody else had a box of cigars he'd picked up in Ravik's quarters on the 4th floor and was passing them around. Joe and about 200 or 300 other hunters came crowding up the escalator, which they had turned on below. "You didn't find Bish Ware either, I'll bet," Joe was saying. "I'm afraid they took him along for a hostage," Oscar said. "The guard was knocked out with Walt's gas gadget that Bish was carrying." "Ha!" Joe cried. "Bet you it was the other way round. Bish took them out." That started an argument. While it was going on, I went to the communication screen and got the Times, and told Dad what had happened. "Yes," he said, "that was what I was afraid you'd find. Glenn Morrell called in from the spaceport a few minutes ago. He says Mort Hallstock came in with his car, and he heard from some of the workmen that Bish Ware, Steve Ravik, and Leo Belcher came in on the main city level in a jeep. They claimed protection from a mob, and Captain Cortland's police are protecting them." Chapter 19. Masks Off. There was dead silence for 2 or 3 seconds. If a kitten had sneezed, everybody would have heard it. Then it started. First, an inarticulate roar, and then a babble of unprintabilities. I thought I'd heard some bad language from these same men in this room when Leo Belcher's announcement of the price cut had been telecast, but that was prayer meeting to this. Dad was still talking. At least, I saw his lips move in the screen. "Say that again, Ralph," Oscar Fujisawa shouted. Dad must have heard him. At least, his lips moved again, but I wasn't a lip reader, and neither was Oscar. Oscar turned to the mob. By now it was that, pure and simple, and roared, in a voice like a foghorn, "Shut up and listen!" A few of those closest to him heard him. The rest kept on shouting curses. Oscar waited a second, and then pointed his submachine gun at the ceiling and hammered off a whole clip. "Shut up, a couple of 100 of you, and listen!" he commanded, on the heels of the blast. Then he turned to the screen again. "Now, Ralph, what was it you were saying?" "Hallstock got to the spaceport about half an hour ago," Dad said. "He bought a ticket to Terra. Sigurd Ngazori's here. He called the bank, and one of the clerks there told him that Hallstock had checked out his whole account, around 300,000 sols. Took some of it in cash and the rest in banking cartel drafts. Morrell says that his information is that Bish Ware, Steve Ravik, and Leo Belcher arrived earlier, about an hour ago. He didn't see them himself, but he talked with spaceport workmen who did. The men who had crowded up to the screen seemed to have run out of oaths and obscenities now. Oscar was fitting another clip into his submachine gun. "Well, we'll have to go to the spaceport and get them," he said, "and take 4 ropes instead of 3. "You'll have to fight your way in," Dad told him. "Odin Dock and Shipyard won't let you take people out of their spaceport without a fight. They've all bought tickets by now, and Feishi will have to protect them." "Then we'll kick the blankety-blank spaceport apart," somebody shouted. That started it up again. Oscar wondered if getting silence was worth another clip of cartridges, and decided it wasn't. He managed to make himself heard without it. "We'll do nothing of the kind. We need that spaceport to stay alive. But we will take Ravik and Belcher and Hallstock. And that Etoine Sherdlu traitor of a Ware," Joe Kyvelson added. "And Bish Ware," Oscar agreed. "They only have 50 police. We have 3,000 or 4,000 men." 3,000 or 4,000 undisciplined hunters against 50 trained, disciplined, and organized soldiers, because that was what the spaceport police were. I knew their captain and the lieutenants. They were old regular army, and they ran the police force like a military unit. "I'll bet Ware was working for Ravik all along," Joe was saying. That wasn't good thinking, even for Joe Kyvelson. I said, "If he was working for Ravik all along, why did he tip Dad and Oscar and the Mahatma on the bomb aboard the Javelin? That wasn't any help to Ravik." "I get it," Oscar said. "He never was working for anybody but Bish Ware. When Ravik got into a jam, he saw a way to make something for himself by getting Ravik out of it. I'll bet, ever since he came here, he was planning to cut in on Ravik somehow. You notice, he knew just how much money Ravik had stashed away on Terra. When he saw the spot Ravik was in, Bish just thought he had a chance to develop himself another rich uncle." I'd been worse stunned than anybody by Dad's news. The worst of it was that Oscar could be right. I hadn't thought of that before. I just thought that Ravik and Belcher had gotten Bish drunk and found out about the way the men were posted around Hunter's Hall and the lone man in the jeep on second level down. Then it occurred to me that Bish might have seen a way of getting Fenris rid of Ravik and at the same time save everybody the guilt of lynching him. Maybe he'd turn traitor to save the rest of us from ourselves. I turned to Oscar. "Why get excited about it?" I asked. "You have what you wanted. You said yourself that you couldn't care less whether Ravik got away or not, as long as you got him out of the co-op. Well, he's out for good now." "That was before the fire," Oscar said. "We didn't have a couple of million sols worth of wax burned. And Tom Kyvelson wasn't in the hospital with half the skin burned off his back, and a coin toss whether he lives or not." "Yes, I thought you were Tom's friend," Joe Kyvelson reproached me. I wondered how much skin hanging Steve Ravik would grow on Tom's back. I didn't see much percentage in asking him, though. I did turn to Oscar Fujisawa with a quotation I remembered from Moby Dick, the book he'd named his ship from. "How many barrels will thy vengeance yield thee, even if thee gettest it, Captain Ahab?" I asked. "It will not fetch thee much in our Nantucket market." He looked at me angrily and started to say something, then he shrugged. "I know, Walt," he said, "but you can't measure everything in barrels of whale oil, or skins of tallow wax." Which was one of those perfectly true statements which are also perfectly meaningless. I gave up. My job's to get the news, not to make it. I wondered if that meant anything either. They finally got the mob sorted out, after a lot of time wasted in pillaging Ravik's living quarters on the 4th floor. However, the troops stopped to loot the enemy's camp. I'd come across that line 50 to 100 times in history books. Usually, it had been expensive looting. If the enemy didn't counterattack, they managed, at least, to escape. More to the point, they gathered up all the cannon and machine guns around the place and got them onto contragravity in the street. There must have been close to 5,000 men by now, and those who couldn't crowd onto vehicles marched on foot, and the whole mass, looking a little more like an army than a mob, started up Broadway. Since it is not proper for reporters to loot on the job, I had gotten outside in my Jeep early and was going ahead, swinging my camera back to get the parade behind me. Might furnish a still-shot illustration for somebody's history of Fenris in a century or so. Broadway was empty until we came to the gateway to the spaceport area. There was a single medium combat car there, on contragravity, halfway to the ceiling, with a pair of 50mm guns and a rocket launcher pointed at us, and under it, on the roadway, a solitary man in an olive-green uniform stood. I knew him, Lieutenant Ranjit Singh, Captain Cortland's second-in-command. He was a Sikh. Instead of a steel helmet, he wore a striped turban, and he had a black beard that made Joe Kivelson's blond one look like Tom Kivelson's chin fuzz. On his belt, along with his pistol, he wore the little kirpan, the dagger all Sikhs carry. He also carried a belt radio, and as we approached, he lifted the phone to his mouth and a loudspeaker on the combat car threw his voice at us. "All right, that's far enough now. The first vehicle that comes within 100 yards of this gate will be shot down." 1 man and 1 combat car, against 5,000, with 20-odd guns and close to 100 machine guns. He'd last about as long as a pint of trade gin at a Sheshan funeral. The only thing was, before he and the crew of the combat car were killed, they'd wipe out about 10 or 15 of our vehicles and a couple of 100 men. And they would be the men and vehicles in the lead. Mobs are a little different from soldiers, and our rebel army was still a mob. Mobs don't like to advance into certain death, and they don't like to advance over the bodies and wreckage of their own forward elements. Neither do soldiers, but soldiers will do it. Soldiers realize, when they put on the uniform, that someday they may face death in battle, and if this is it, this is it. I got the combat car and the lone soldier in the turban. That would look good in anybody's history book, and moved forward, taking care that he saw the Times lettering on the Jeep and taking care to stay well short of the deadline. I let down to the street and got out, taking off my gun belt and hanging it on the control handle of the Jeep. Then I walked forward. "Lieutenant Ranjit," I said, "I'm representing the Times. I have business inside the spaceport. I want to get the facts about this. It may be that, when I get this story, these people will be satisfied." "We will, like Niflheim," I heard Joe Kivelson bawling above and behind me. "We want the men who started the fire my son got burned in." "Is that the Kivelson boy's father?" the Sikh asked me, and when I nodded, he lifted the phone to his lips again. "Captain Kivelson," the loudspeaker said, "your son is alive and under skin grafting treatment here at the Spaceport Hospital. His life is not, repeat, not in danger. The men you are after are here under guard. If any of them are guilty of any crimes, and if you can show any better authority than an armed mob to deal with them, they may, I said, be turned over for trial. But they will not be taken from this spaceport by force, as long as I or one of my men remains alive." "That's easy. We'll get them afterward," Joe Kivelson shouted. "Somebody may. You won't," Ranjit Singh told him. "Van Steen, hit that ship's boat first, and hit it at the first hostile move anybody in this mob makes. "Yes, sir, with pleasure," another voice replied. Nobody in the rebel army, if that was what it still was, had any comment to make on that. Lieutenant Ranjit turned to me. "Mr. Boyd," he said. None of this sonny boy stuff. Ranjit Singh was a man of dignity, and he respected the dignity of others. "If I admit you to the spaceport, will you give these people the facts exactly as you learned them?" "That's what the Times always does, Lieutenant." "Well, almost all the facts, almost always." "Will you people accept what this Times reporter tells you he has learned?" "Yes, of course." That was Oscar Fujisawa. "I won't." That was Joe Kyvelson. "He's always taking the part of that old rumpot of a Bish Ware." "Lieutenant, that remark was a slur on my paper as well as myself," I said. "Will you permit Captain Kyvelson to come in along with me, and somebody else," I couldn't resist adding, "so that people will believe him?" Ranjit Singh considered that briefly. He wasn't afraid to die. I believe he was honestly puzzled when he heard people talking about fear. But his job was to protect some fugitives from a mob, not to die a useless hero's death. If letting in a small delegation would prevent an attack on the spaceport without loss of life and ammunition, or maybe he reversed the order of importance, he was obliged to try it. "Yes, you may choose 5 men to accompany Mr. Boyd," he said. "They may not bring weapons in with them. Sidearms," he added, "will not count as weapons." After all, a kirpan was a sidearm, and his religion required him to carry that. The decision didn't make me particularly happy. Respect for the dignity of others is a fine thing in an officer, but, like journalistic respect for facts, it can be carried past the point of being a virtue. I thought he was overestimating Joe Kyvelson's self-control. Vehicles in front began grounding, and men got out and bunched together on the street. Finally, they picked their delegation. Joe Kyvelson, Oscar Fujisawa, Casimir Ogurlian, the shipyard man, one of the engineers at the nutrient plant, and the Reverend Hiram Zilker, the Orthodox Monophysite preacher. They all had pistols, even the Reverend Zilker, so I went back to the jeep and put mine on. Ranjit Singh had switched his radio off the speaker and was talking to somebody else. After a while, an olive-green limousine, piloted by a policeman in uniform and helmet, floated in and grounded. The 6 of us got into it, and it lifted again. The car let down in a vehicle hall in the administrative area, and the police second lieutenant, Chris Santos, was waiting alone, armed only with the pistol that was part of his uniform, and wearing a beret instead of a helmet. He spoke to us and ushered us down a hallway toward Guido Feischi's office. I get into the spaceport administrative area about once in 20 or so hours. Ogurlian is a somewhat less frequent visitor. The others had never been there, and they were visibly awed by all the gleaming glass and brightwork, and the soft lights and the thick carpets. All Port Sandor ought to look like this, I thought. It could, and maybe now it might, after a while. There were 6 chairs in a semicircle facing Guido Feischi's desk, and 3 men sitting behind it. Feischi, who had changed clothes and washed since the last time I saw him, sat on the extreme right. Captain Cortlandt, with his tight mouth under a gray mustache and the quadruple row of metal ribbons on his breast, was on the left. In the middle, the seat of honor, was Bish Ware, looking as though he were presiding over a church council to try some rural curate for heresy. As soon as Joe Kyvelson saw him, he roared angrily, "There's the dirty traitor who sold us out! He's the worst of the lot! I wouldn't be surprised if—" Bish looked at him like a bishop who has just been contradicted on a point of doctrine by a choir boy. "Be quiet," he ordered. "I did not follow this man you call Ravik here to this running hot and cold paradise planet, and I did not spend 5 years fraternizing with its unwashed citizenry and creating for myself the role of town drunkard of Port Sandor, to have him taken from me and lynched after I have arrested him. People do not lynch my prisoners." "And who in blazes are you?" Joe demanded. Bish took cognizance of the question, if not the questioner. "Tell them, if you please, Mr. Feishy," he said. "Well, Mr. Ware is a Terran Federation Executive Special Agent," Feishy said. "Captain Cortland and I have known that for the past 5 years. As far as I know, nobody else was informed of Mr. Ware's position." After that, you could have heard a gnat sneeze. Everybody knows about Executive Special Agents. There are all kinds of secret agents operating in the Federation, Army and Navy intelligence, police of different sorts, colonial office agents, private detectives, chartered company agents. But there are fewer executive specials than there are inhabited planets in the Federation. They rank, ex officio, as Army generals and Space Navy admirals. They have the privilege of the floor in Parliament. They take orders from nobody but the President of the Federation. But very few people have ever seen one, or talked to anybody who has. And Bish Ware, good old Bish, he's everybody's friend, was one of them. And I have been trying to make a man out of him and reform him. I'd even thought, if he'd stopped drinking, he might make a success as a private detective, at Port Sandor, on Fenris. I wondered what color my face had gotten now, and I started looking around for a crack in the floor to trickle gently and unobtrusively into. And it should have been obvious to me, maybe not that he was an executive special, but that he was certainly no drunken barfly. The way he'd gone 4 hours without a drink, and seemed to be just as drunk as ever. That was right. Just as drunk as he'd ever been, which was to say, cold sober. There was the time I'd seen him catch that falling bottle and set it up. No drunken man could have done that. A man's reflexes are the first thing to be affected by alcohol. And the way he shot that tread snail. I've seen men who could shoot well on liquor, but not quick-draw stuff. That calls for perfect coordination. And the way he went into his tipsy act at the times, veteran actor slipping into a well-learned role. He drank, sure. He did a lot of drinking. But there are men whose systems resist the effects of alcohol better than others, and he must have been an exceptional example of the type, or he'd never have adopted the sort of cover personality he did. It would have been fairly easy for him. Space his drinks widely, and never take a drink unless he had to maintain the act. When he was at the Times with just Dad and me, what did he have? A fruit fizz. Well, at least I could see it after I had my nose rubbed in it. Joe Kyvelson was simply gaping at him. The Reverend Zilker seemed to be having trouble adjusting too. The shipyard man and the chemical engineer weren't saying anything, but it had kicked them for a loss too. Oscar Fujisawa was making a noble effort to be completely unsurprised. Oscar is one of our better poker players. "I thought it might be something like that," he lied brazenly. "But Bish, I mean Mr. Ware." "Bish, if you please, Oscar." "Bish, what I'd like to know is what you wanted with Ravik," he said. "They didn't send any executive special agent here for 5 years to investigate this tallow wax racket of his." "No. We have been looking for him for a long time. 15 years, and I've been working on it that long. You might say I have made a career of him. Steve Ravik is really Anton Garrett." Maybe he was expecting us to leap from our chairs and cry out, "Aha! The infamous Anton Garrett! Brought to book at last!" We didn't. We just looked at one another, trying to connect some meaning to the name. It was Joe Kyvelson, of all people, who caught the first gleam. "I know that name," he said. "Something on Loki, wasn't it?" "Yes, that was it. Now that my nose was rubbed in it again, I got it." "The Loki enslavements. Was that it?" I asked. "I read about it, but I never seem to have heard of Garrett." "He was the mastermind. The ones who were caught 15 years ago were the underlings, but Ravik was the real number one. He was responsible for the enslavement of from 20 to 30,000 Lokian natives, gentle, harmless, friendly people, most of whom were worked to death in the mines. No wonder an executive special would put in 15 years looking for him. You murder your grandmother, or rob a bank, or burn down an orphanage with the orphans all in bed upstairs, or something trivial like that, and if you make an off-planet getaway, you're reasonably safe. Of course, there's such a thing as extradition, but who bothers? Distances are too great, and communication is too slow, and the Federation depends on every planet to do its own policing. But enslavement's something different. The Terran Federation is a government of and for, if occasionally not by, all sapient peoples of all races. The Federation Constitution guarantees equal rights to all. Making slaves of people, human or otherwise, is a direct blow at everything the Federation stands for. No wonder they kept hunting 15 years for the man responsible for the Loki enslavements. Garrett got away with a month's start. By the time we had traced him to Baldur, he had a year's start on us. He was 5 years ahead of us when we found out that he'd gone from Baldur to Odin. 6 years ago, 9 years after we'd started hunting for him, we decided, from the best information we could get, that he had left Odin on one of the local stop ships for Terra and dropped off along the way. There are 6 planets at which those Terra-Odin ships stop. We sent a man to each of them. I drew this prize out of the hat. When I landed here, I contacted Mr. Feishi, and we found that a man answering to Garrett's description had come in on the Peeneminda from Odin 7 years before, about the time Garrett had left Odin. The man who called himself Steve Ravik. Of course, he didn't look anything like the pictures of Garrett, but facial surgery was something we'd taken for granted he'd have done. I finally managed to get his fingerprints. Special Agent Ware took out a cigar, inspected it with the drunken over-solemnity he'd been drilling himself into for 5 years, and lit it. Then he saw what he was using and rose holding it out, and I went to the desk and took back my lighter weapon. "Thank you, Walt. I wouldn't have been able to do this if I hadn't had that." Where was I? Oh, yes. I got Garrett alias Ravik's fingerprints, which did not match the ones we had on file for Garrett, and sent them in. It was 18 months later that I got a reply on them. According to his fingerprints, Steve Ravik was really a woman named Ernestine Coyon, who had died of acute alcoholism in the free public ward of a hospital at Paris on Baldur 14 years ago. "Why, that's incredible!" the Reverend Zilker burst out, and Joe Kyvelson was saying, "Steve Ravik isn't any woman." "Least of all, one who died 14 years ago," Bish agreed. "But the fingerprints were hers. A pauper dying in a public ward of a big hospital, and a man who has to change his identity and who has small, woman-sized hands, and a crooked hospital staff surgeon. You get the picture now?" "They're doing the same thing on Tom's back right here," I told Joe. "Only you can't grow fingerprints by carniculture the way you can human tissue for grafting. They had to have palm and finger surfaces from a pair of real human hands. A pauper, dying in a free treatment ward, her body shoved into a mass energy converter." Then I thought of something else. "That show-off trick of his, crushing out cigarettes in his palm," I said. Bish nodded commendingly. "Exactly. He'd have about as much sensation in his palms as I'd have wearing thick leather gloves. I'd noticed that. Well, 6 months going, and a couple of months waiting on reports from other planets, and 6 months coming, and so on, and it wasn't until the Paynaminda got in from Terra the last time that I got final confirmation. Dr. Watson, you'll recall. Who, you perceived, had been in Afghanistan, I mentioned, trying to salvage something. Showing off. The one I was trying to impress was Walt Boyd. You caught that? Careless of me, Bish chided himself. What he gave me was a report that they had finally located a man who had been a staff surgeon at this hospital on Balder at the time. He's now doing a stretch for another piece of malpractice he was unlucky enough to get caught at later. We will not admit making any deals with any criminals, in jail or out, but he is willing to testify, and he is on his way to Terra now. He can identify pictures of Anton Garrett as those of the man he operated on 14 years ago, and his testimony and Ernestine Koyon's fingerprints will identify Ravik as that man. With all the Colonial Constabulary and Army intelligence people got on Garrett on Loki, simple identification will be enough. Garrett was proven guilty long ago, and it won't be any trouble now to prove that Ravik is Garrett. Why didn't you arrest him as soon as you got the word from your friend from Afghanistan? I wanted to know. Good question. I've been asking myself that, Bish said, a trifle wryly. If I had, the Javelin wouldn't have been bombed, the wax wouldn't have been burned, and Tom Kyvelson wouldn't have been injured. What I did was send my friend, who is a Colonial Constabulary detective, to Gimli, the next planet out. There's a naval base there, and always at least a couple of destroyers available. He's coming back with one of them to pick Garrett up and take him to Terra. They ought to be in about 250 hours. I thought it would be safer all around to let Garrett run loose till then. There's no place he could go. What I didn't realize, at the time, was what a human H-bomb this man Morell would turn into. Then everything blew up at once. Finally, I was left with the choice of helping Garrett escape from Hunter's Hall or having him lynched before I could arrest him. He turned to Kyvelson. In the light of what you knew, I don't blame you for calling me a dirty traitor. But how did I know? Kyvelson began. That's right. You weren't supposed to. That was before you found out. You ought to have heard what Garrett and Belcher, as far as I know, that is his real name, called me after they found out, when they got out of that jeep and Captain Cortland's men snapped the handcuffs on them. It even shocked a hardened sinner like me. There was a lot more of it. Bish had managed to get into Hunter's Hall just about the time Al Davis and his companion were starting the fire Ravik, Garrett, had ordered for a diversion. The whole gang was going to crash out as soon as the fire had attracted everybody away. Bish led them out onto the second level down, sleep-gassed the lone man in the jeep, and took them to the spaceport, where the police were waiting for them. As soon as I'd gotten everything, I called the Times. I'd had my radio on all the time, and it had been coming in perfectly. Dad, I was happy to observe, was every bit as flabbergasted as I had been at who and what Bish Ware was. He might throw my campaign to reform Bish up at me later on, but at the moment he wasn't disposed to, and I was praising Allah silently that I hadn't had a chance to mention the detective agency idea to him. That would have been a little too much. "What are they doing about Belcher and Hallstock?" he asked. "Belcher goes back to Terra with Ravik. Garrett, I mean. That's where he collected his cut on the Talawax, so that is where he'd have to be tried. Bish is convinced that somebody in Capstad Chemical must have been involved, too. Hallstock is strictly a local matter." "That's about what I thought. With all this interstellar back and forth, it'll be a long time before we'll be able to write 30 under the story." "Well, we can put 30 under the Steve Ravik story," I said. Then it hit me. The Steve Ravik story was finished. That is, the local story of racketeering rule in the Hunters Cooperative. But the Anton Garrett story was something else. That was Federation-wide news. The end of a 15-year manhunt for the most wanted criminal in the known galaxy. And who had that story right in his hot little hand? Walter Boyd, the ace and only reporter for the mighty Port Sandor Times. Yes, I continued, the Ravik story's finished. But we still have the Anton Garrett story, and I'm going to work on it right now. Chapter 20. Finale. They had Tom Kivleson in a private room at the hospital. He was sitting up in a chair with a lot of pneumatic cushions around him and a lunch tray on his lap. He looked white and thin. He could move one arm completely, but the bandages they had loaded him with seemed to have left the other free only at the elbow. He was concentrating on his lunch, and must have thought I was one of the nurses, or a doctor, or something of the sort. "Are you going to let me have a cigarette and a cup of coffee when I'm through with this?" he asked. "Well, I don't have any coffee, but you can have one of my cigarettes," I said. Then he looked up and gave a whoop. "Walt, how'd you get in here? I thought they weren't going to let anybody in to see me till this afternoon." "Power of the press," I told him. "Bluff, blarney, and blackmail. How are they treating you?" "Awful. Look what they gave me for lunch. I thought we were on short rations down on Herman Rauch's land. How's Father?" "He's all right. They took the splint off, but he still has to carry his arm in a sling." "Lucky guy. He can get around on his feet, and I'll bet he isn't starving either. You know, speaking about food, I'm going to feel like a cannibal eating carniculture meat now. My whole back's carniculture." He filled his mouth with whatever it was they were feeding him and asked through it, "Did I miss Steve Ravik's hanging?" I was horrified. "Haven't these people told you anything?" I demanded. "Nah, they wouldn't even tell me the right time. Afraid it would excite me." So I told him, first who Bish Ware really was, and then who Ravik really was. He gaped for a moment and then shoveled in more food. "Go on, what happened?" I told him how Bish had smuggled Garrett and Leo Belcher out on second level down and gotten them to the spaceport, where Cortland's men had been waiting for them. "Garrett's going to Terra, and from there to Loki. They want the natives to see what happens to a Terran who breaks Terran law. Teach them that our law isn't just to protect us. Belcher's going to Terra, too. There was a big ship captains meeting. They voted to reclaim their wax and sell it individually to Morel, but to retain membership in the co-op. They think they'll have to stay in the co-op to get anything that's gettable out of Garrett's and Belcher's money. Oscar Fujisawa and Cesario Vieira are going to Terra on the Cape Canaveral to start suit to recover anything they can, and also to petition for reclassification of Fenris. Oscar's coming back on the next ship, but Cesario's going to stay on as the co-op representative. I suppose he and Linda will be getting married." "Natch, they'll both stay on Terra, I suppose." "Hey, what do you know? Cesario's getting off Fenris without having to die and reincarnate." He finished his lunch, such as it was, and what there was of it, and I relieved him of the tray and set it on the floor beyond his chair. I found an ashtray and lit a cigarette for him, and one for myself, using the big lighter. Tom looked at it dubiously, predicting that sometime I'd push the wrong thing and send myself bye-byes for a couple of hours. I told him how Bish had used it. "Bet a lot of people wanted to hang him, too, before they found out who he was and what he'd really done. What's my father think of Bish now?" "Bish Ware is a great and good man, and the savior of Fenris," I said. "And he was real smart, to keep an act like that up for 5 years. Your father modestly admits that it even fooled him." "Bet Oscar Fujisawa knew it all along." "Well, Oscar modestly admits that he suspected something of the sort, but he didn't feel it was his place to say anything." Tom laughed, and then wanted to know if they were going to hang Mort Hallstock. "I hope they can wait till I can get out of here." "No. Odin Dock and Shipyard claim he's a political refugee, and they won't give him up. They did loan us a couple of accountants to go over the city books to see if we could find any real evidence of misappropriation. And what do you know? There were no city books. The city of Port Sandor didn't keep books. We can't even take that 300,000 sols away from him. For all we can prove, he saved them out of his 5,000 sol a year salary. He's shipping out on the Cape Canaveral, too." "Then we don't have any government at all." "Are you fooling yourself we ever had one?" "No, but—" "Well, we have one now. A temporary dictatorship. Bish Ware is dictator. Faishi loaned him Ranjit Singh and some of his men. The first thing he did was gather up the city treasurer and the chief of police and march them to the spaceport. Faishi made Hallstock buy them tickets, too. But there aren't going to be any unofficial hangings. This is a law-abiding planet now." A nurse came in and disapproved of Tom smoking and of me being in the room at all. "Haven't you had your lunch yet?" she asked Tom. He looked at her guilelessly and said, "No, I was waiting for it." "Well, I'll get it," she said. "I thought the other nurse had brought it." She started out, and then she came back and had to fuss with his cushions, and then she saw the tray on the floor. "You did so have your lunch," she accused. Tom looked at her as innocently as ever. "Oh, you mean these samples? Why, they were good. I'll take all of them. And a big slab of roast beef, and brown gravy, and mashed potatoes. And how about some ice cream?" It was a good try. Too bad it didn't work. "Don't worry, Tom," I told him. "I'll get my lawyer to spring you out of this jug, and then we'll take you to my place and fill you up on Mrs. Layden's cooking." The nurse sniffed. She suspected, quite correctly, that whoever Mrs. Layden was, she didn't know anything about scientific dietetics. When I got back to the Times, Dad and Julio had had their lunch and were going over the teleprint edition. Julio was printing corrections on blank sheets of plastic, and Dad was cutting them out and cementing them over things that needed correcting on the master sheets. I gave Julio a short item to the effect that Tom Kybelson, son of Captain and Mrs. Joe Kybelson, one of the Javelin survivors who had been burned in the tallow wax fire, was now out of all danger and recovering. Dad was able to scrounge that onto the first page. There was a lot of other news. The TFN destroyer Simone Bolivar, en route from Gimli to pick up the notorious Anton Garrett, alias Steve Ravik, had come out of hyperspace and into radio range. Dad had talked to the skipper by screen and gotten interviews, which would be telecast, both with him and Detective Major McBride of the Colonial Constabulary. The Simone Bolivar would not make landing, but go into orbit and send down a boat. Detective Major McBride, alias Dr. John Watson, would remain on Fenris to take over local police activities. More evidence had been unearthed at Hunter's Hall on the frauds practiced by Leo Belcher and Garrett, alias Ravik. It looked as though a substantial sum of money might be recovered eventually from the bank accounts and other holdings of both men on Terra. Acting Resident Agent Gonzalo Ware, it seemed really was his right name, but look what he had in front of it, had promulgated more regulations and edicts, and a crackdown on the worst waterfront dives was in progress. I'll bet the devoted flock was horrified at what their beloved bishop had turned into. Bish would leave his diocese in a lot healthier condition than he'd found it. That was one thing for sure. And most of the gang of thugs and plug-uglies who had been used to intimidate and control the Hunters Cooperative had been gathered up and jailed on vagrancy charges. Prisoners were being put to work cleaning up the city. And there was a lot about plans for a registration of voters and organization of election boards, and a local electronics engineering firm had been awarded a contract for voting machines. I didn't think there had ever been a voting machine on Fenris before. The commander of the Bolivar says he'll take your story to Terra with him and see that it gets to Interworld News, Dad told me as we were sorting the corrected master sheets and loading them into the photoprint machine to be sent out on the air. The Bolivar will make Terra at least 200 hours ahead of the Cape Canaveral. Interworld would be glad to have it. It isn't often they get a story like that with the first news of anything, and this'll be a big story. You shouldn't have given me the exclusive byline, I said. You did as much work on it as I did. No, I didn't either, he contradicted, and I knew what I was doing. With the work done, I remembered that I hadn't had anything to eat since breakfast, and I went down to take inventory of the refrigerator. Dad went along with me, and after I had assembled a lunch and sat down to it, he decided that his pipe needed refilling, lit it, poured a cup of coffee, and sat down with me. "You know, Walt, I've been thinking lately," he began. Uh-oh, I thought. When Dad makes that remark, in just that tone, it's all hands to secure ship for diving. "We've all had to do a lot of thinking lately," I agreed. "Yes. You know, they want me to be mayor of Port Sandor." I nodded and waited till I got my mouth empty. I could see a lot of sense in that. Dad is honest and scrupulous and public-spirited, too much so sometimes for his own good. There wasn't any question of his ability, and while there had always been antagonism between the Hunter ship crews and waterfront people and the uptown business crowd, Dad was well liked and trusted by both parties. "Are you going to take it?" I asked. "I suppose I'll have to, if they really want me. Be a sort of obligation." That would throw a lot more work on me. Dad could give some attention to the paper as mayor, but not as much as now. "What do you want me to try to handle for you?" I asked. "Well, Walt, that's what I've been thinking about," he said. "I've been thinking about it for a long time, and particularly since things got changed around here. I think you ought to go to school some more." That made me laugh. "What? Back to Hartzenbosch?" I asked. "I could teach him more than he could teach me now." "I doubt that, Walt. Professor Hartzenbosch may be an old maid in trousers, but he's really a very sound scholar. But I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about your going to Terra to school." "Huh?" I forgot to eat for a moment. "Let's stop kidding." "I didn't start kidding. I meant it." "Well, think again, Dad. It costs money to go to school on Terra. It even costs money to go to Terra." "We have a little money, Walt. Maybe more than you think we do. And with things getting better, we'll lease more teleprinters and get more advertising. You're likely to get better than the price of your passage out of that story we're sending off on the Bolivar, and that won't be the end of it either. Fenris is going to be in the news for a while. You may make some more money writing. That's why I was careful to give you the byline on that Garrett story." His pipe had gone out again. He took time out to relight it, and then added, "Anything I spend on this is an investment. The Times will get it back." "Yes, that's another thing, the paper," I said. "If you're going to be mayor, you won't be able to do everything you're doing on the paper now, and then do all my work too." "Well, shocking as the idea may be, I think we can find somebody to replace you." "Name one," I challenged. "Well, Lillian Arnaz at the library has always been interested in newspaper work," he began. "A girl?" I hooted. "You have any idea of some of the places I have to go to get stories?" "Yes, I have always deplored the necessity. But a great many of them have been closed lately, and the rest are being run in a much more seemly manner. And she wouldn't be the only reporter. I hesitate to give you any better opinion of yourself than you have already, but it would take at least 3 people to do the work you've been doing. When you get back from Terra, you'll find the Times will have a very respectable reportorial staff." "What'll I be then?" I wondered. "Editor," Dad told me. "I'll retire and go into politics full-time. And if Fenris is going to develop the way I believe it will, the editor of the Times will need a much better education than I have." I kept on eating to give myself an excuse for silence. He was right, I knew that. But college on Terra, why, that would be at least 4 years, maybe 5, and then a year for the round trip. "Walt, this doesn't have to be settled right away," Dad said. "You won't be going on the Simone Bolivar along with Ravik and Belcher. And that reminds me, have you talked to Bish lately? He'd be hurt if you didn't see him before he left." The truth was, I'd been avoiding Bish, and not just because I knew how busy he was. My face felt like a tallow wax fire every time I thought of how I'd been trying to reform him, and I didn't quite know what I'd be able to say to him if I met him again. And he seemed to me to be an entirely different person, as though the old Bish Ware, whom I had liked in spite of what I thought he was, had died, and some total stranger had taken his place. But I went down to the municipal building. It didn't look like the same place. The walls had been scrubbed, the floors were free from litter. All the drove of loafers and hangers-on had been run out, or maybe jailed and put to work. I looked into a couple of offices. Everybody in them was busy. A few of the old police force were still there, but their uniforms had been cleaned and pressed. They had all shaved recently, and 1 or 2 looked as though they liked being able to respect themselves for a change. The girl at the desk in the mayor's outside office told me Bish had a delegation of uptown merchants who seemed to think that reform was all right in its place, but it oughtn't to be carried more than a few blocks above the waterfront. They were protesting the new sanitary regulations. Then she buzzed Bish on the handphone and told me he'd see me in a few minutes. After a while, I heard the delegation going down the hall from the private office door. One of them was saying, "Well, this is what we've always been screaming our heads off for. Now we've got it, good and hard. We'll just have to get used to it." When I went in, Bish rose from his desk and came to meet me, shaking my hand. He looked and was dressed like the old Bish Ware I'd always known. "Glad you dropped in, Walt. Find a seat. How are things on the Times?" "You ought to know. You're making things busy for us." "Yes, there's so much to do and so little time to do it. Seems as though I've heard somebody say that before." "Are you going back to Terra on the Simone Bolivar?" "Oh, Allah forbid! I made a trip on a destroyer once, and once is enough for a lifetime. I won't even be able to go on the Cape Canaveral. I'll take the Peenemünde when she comes in. I'm glad McBride, Dr. Watson, is going to stop off. He'll be a big help. Don't know what I'd have done without Ranjit Singh." "That won't be till after the Cape Canaveral gets back from Terra." "No, that's why I'm waiting. Don't publish this, Walt. I don't want to start any premature rumors that might end in disappointments, but I've recommended immediate reclassification to Class 3, and there may be a colonial office man on the Cape Canaveral when she gets in. Resident agent permanent. I hope so. He'll need a little breaking in." "I saw Tom Kybelson this morning," I said. "He seems to be getting along pretty well." "Didn't anybody at the hospital tell you about him?" Bish asked. I shook my head. He cursed all hospital staffs. "I wish military security was half as good. Why, Tom's permanently injured. He won't be crippled or anything like that, but there was considerable unrepairable damage to his back muscles. He'll be able to get around, but I doubt it he'll ever be able to work on a hunter ship again." I was really horrified. monster hunting was Tom's whole life. I said something like that. He'll just have to make a new life for himself. Joe says he is going to send him to school on Terra. He thinks that was his own idea, but I suggested it to him. Dad wants me to go to school on Terra. Well, that's a fine idea. Tom's going on the Peenemünde along with me. Why don't you come with us? That would be great, Bish. I'd like it, but I just can't. Why not? Well, they want Dad to be mayor, and if he runs, they'll all vote for him. He can't handle this and the paper both alone. He can get help on both jobs. Yes, but, why, it would be years till I get back. I can't sacrifice the time. Not now. I'd say 6 years. You could spend your voyage time from here cramming for entrance qualifications. Schools don't bother about academic credits anymore. They're only interested in how much you know. You take 4 years regular college and a year post-grading, and you'll have all the formal education you'll need. But Bish, I can get that here, at the library, I said. We have every book on film that's been published since year 0. Yes, and you'd die of old age before you got a quarter through the first film bank, and you still wouldn't have an education. Do you know which books to study and which ones not to bother with? Or which ones to read first, so that what you read in the others will be comprehensible to you? That's what they'll give you on Terra. The tools, which you don't have now, for educating yourself. I thought that over. It made sense. I'd had a lot of the very sort of trouble he'd spoken of, trying to get information for myself in proper order, and I'd read a lot of books that duplicated others I'd read, and books I had trouble understanding because I hadn't read some other book first. Bish had something there. I was sure he had. But 6 years... I said that aloud and added, I can't take the time. I have to be doing things. You'll do things. You'll do them a lot better for waiting those 6 years. You aren't 18 yet. 6 years is a whole third of your past life. No wonder it seems long to you. But you're thinking the wrong way. You're relating those 6 years to what has passed. Relate them to what's ahead of you, and see how little time they are. You take ordinary care of yourself and keep out of any more civil wars, and you have 60 more years at least. Your 6 years at school are only 1/10 of that. I was 50 when I came here to this Creator's blunder of a planet. Say I had only 20 more years. I spent a quarter of them playing town drunk here. I'm the one who ought to be in a rush and howling about lost time, not you. I ought to be in such a hurry I'd take the Simone Bolivar to Terra and let this place go to anywhere you might imagine to be worse. You know, I don't think you like Fenris. I don't. If I were a drinking man, this planet would have made a drunkard of me. Now, you forget about these 6 years chopped out of your busy life. When you get back here, with an education, you'll be a kid of 24, with a big, long life ahead of you, and your mind stocked with things you don't have now that will help you make something, and more important, something enjoyable, out of it. There was a huge crowd at the spaceport to see us off, Tom and Bish Ware and me. Mostly, it was for Bish. If I don't find a monument to him when I get back, I'll know there is no such thing as gratitude. There had been a big banquet for us the evening before, and I think Bish actually got a little tipsy. Nobody can be sure, though. It might have been just the old actor back in his role. Now they were all crowding around us, as many as could jam in the main lounge of the Peenemünde. Joe Kyvelson and his wife, Dad and Julio and Mrs. Layden, who was actually being cordial to Bish, and who had a bundle for us that we weren't to open till we were in hyperspace. Lillian Arnaz, the girl who was to take my place as star reporter. We were going to send each other audiovisuals, advice from me on the job, and news from the Times from her. Glenn Morrell, who had his office open by now, and was grumbling that there had been a man from Interstellar Import-Export out on the Cape Canaveral, and if the competition got any stiffer, the price of tallow wax would be forced up on him to a sol a pound. And all the javelin hands who had been wrecked with us on Herman Rauch's land, and the veterans of the Civil War, all but Oscar and Cesario, who will be at the dock to meet us when we get to Terra. I wonder what it'll be like on a world where you can go to bed every time it gets dark and get up when it gets light, and can go outdoors all the time. I wonder how I'll like college, and meeting people from all over the Federation and swapping tall stories about our home planets. And I wonder what I'll learn. The long years ahead, I can't imagine them now, will be spent on the Times, and I ought to learn things to fit me for that. But I can't get rid of the idea about carniculture growth of tallow wax. We'll have to do something like that. The demand for the stuff is growing, and we don't know how long it'll be before the monsters are hunted out. We know how fast we're killing them, but we don't know how many there are or how fast they breed. I'll talk to Tom about that. Maybe between us we can hit on something, or at least lay a foundation for somebody else who will. The crowd pushed out and off the ship, and the three of us were alone, here in the lounge of the Peenemünde, where the story started and where it ends. Bish says no story ends ever. He's wrong. Stories die, and nothing in the world is deader than a dead news story. But before they do, they hatch a flock of little ones, and some of them grow into bigger stories still. What happens after the ship lifts into darkness, with the pre-dawn glow in the east, will be a new story. But to the story of how the hunters got an honest cooperative, and Fenris got an honest government, and Bish Ware got Anton Garrett the slaver, I can write the end.